Okay, morning both. We move on then to our third evidence session on the Renting Homes Fees, etc. bill. I'm very pleased to welcome Douglas Haig, Vice Chairman and Director for Wales of the Residential Landlords Association, and Chris Norris, Director of Policy and Practice, National Landlords Association. Welcome to you both. If we may move straight to questions, because time is limited as always. And the first questions are from Jenny Rathbone.
Good morning. To what extent do the fees charged to tenants reflect the costs incurred by letting agents, in your opinion?
To letting agents specifically?
Well, obviously it could be letting agents or
Sure.
between yourselves.
I think there is a valid distinction. I think the fees that landlords tend to charge, firstly, they tend to charge them less frequently than letting agents do. It tends to be a less normal part of their cost base and their business structure. I think when we experience landlords directly charging an application fee, let's say, to a tenant, it's directly related to the cost of a referencing service, perhaps, and it's normally splitting that cost. When we see a letting agent charge a fee, I think it's more of a commercial element of their business. So there's certainly a cost element there, and that's the concern for us about the cost being passed on. There's almost certainly going to be a margin that agent is passing, or is using the fee to create.
Okay, is that also...
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Ultimately, I think Chris has already started to make that distinction, but certainly I would say that a lot of landlords currently don't really take account of their time when they're doing an application directly. So if they do charge costs at all, then, which is very rare, I would say. I think your own figures in your impact assessment show that. That at the moment there's no account of the actual time that the landlord puts towards it. So I think they see their time as being involved in the rent that they collect going forwards. In terms of letting agents, yes. I think that part of the reason why we're in this room discussing this at the moment is because there's been some scandalous levels of fees charged by agencies, which I don't think any of us could ever possibly agree with. But I think that the vast majority of agents out there are charging something which is reasonable given their overhead and time involved in doing the application process.
So just at this point, Jenny, just generally in terms of the impact then on landlords and indeed the buy-to-let sector, what would you say that they're likely to be?
Of a complete ban?
Yeah.
So inevitably there's going to be a significant change for landlords. There's going to be a significant change in terms of the way that agents interact with them when they do use them, and the main thing is going to be there's going to be a considerable increase in cost for the landlord, because you can't, whilst you can reduce the total amount of fees that are being levied and the ridiculous fees, there is a core cost to doing the process and the application, which has to go somewhere. And we're concerned about what the level of that cost is, especially when you consider vast areas of Wales and the rent levels that are being charged, and as a result you're probably going to be seeing fees that are well in excess of over a month's worth of rent being charged to a landlord just to complete a letting. So that's one of the major considerations that we have.
I think I concur. There's a consideration of the direct impact when it comes to landlords and the indirect impact. As I say, I don't think for most landlords there's a direct fee charging culture there, but there is a cost. You can ban a fee quite simply, like I say slightly wryly, but you can't eliminate the cost as easily. So that cost is going to filter its way through. Or one of the concerns we have is that cost base will be reduced by a reduction in the quality of the service that's sometimes offered, whether that be to the tenant or to the landlord.
That's a real concern that we have as well, especially for maybe not some of our direct members. I mean, a lot of our members are self-managing landlords, but certainly the landlords that tend to use agents, they're not necessarily as well versed in exactly what the agent should be doing for them. So it's quite easy for the agent to maybe start to reduce the level of service that they've got or that they're giving to the landlord, and as a result of this, in kind of a stealth way. So, and I think that's, for me, this is one of the we've missed an opportunity with this bill, and I will say that I think I know it's not the committee's timetable that has been set here, but I do think that considering the timescale in which we've published this bill and expecting us to come to this committee and give fairly detailed responses. We haven't really had the opportunity to scrutinise it and give you the detailed responses that we would like to do normally. I think there's been a bit of a rush in that, and I think that ultimately it's possibly a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to what's going on in England, and what we would like to have seen happen in Wales is really try and address the three things that you want to do properly, and that's increase the accessibility, the affordability, and continue to increase the professionalisation of this sector. And with I don't think the bill as it stands is going to address any of those areas. You're reducing accessibility because I don't think that ultimately, if by banning fees, you're going to mean that the people that get into tenancies are the ones that are going to be able to easily be able to provide the documentation to get into the properties themselves. In terms of affordability, the fee isn't actually the biggest problem in getting into a property in the first place. You're talking about the first month's rent and the deposit. Are we the way that legislation is being put together, are we possibly restricting the innovation in the sector around creating sort of zero type deposit schemes or insurance-based schemes? In terms of professionalisation, we've got a situation where actually landlords are as much subject to sort of hidden fees and unknown costs, as I've alluded to, in terms of the service that they're getting. This could have been an opportunity to say, well, actually, let's look at this sector. Let's put a cap on the front in terms of tenants' fees. Let's create a clear schedule of things that you have to do, so it creates an equal marketplace for tenants. And actually, let's look at what services landlords are receiving from agents and say that this is the sort of thing that you need to be providing for when you're saying you're managing a property. Because at the moment, you walk down a high street and you'll see 10-12% management fees, and then you'll see an agent with 5% fees, and on the face of it, they look like they're providing the same service. And for maybe some of our less educated landlords, that seems like a very tempting offer, but that's a very dangerous trap to fall in, and that's what's happening a lot of the time.
Okay, I mean, we will come on to a number of the issues that you've mentioned there, but Jenny.
Okay, so I mean, I think we are where we are, so we need to ensure that this bill does the job that we need it to do. In terms of the, I mean, clearly we need to drive out the amateur landlords who are not meeting their obligations and trying to avert the law. Some concerns have been raised that banning fees will mean either agents or landlords will cherry-pick the tenants they want to do business with, and that more vulnerable tenants will be sidestepped and marginalised. Can you, what is your view on that?
I think there is certainly a risk. I mean, if I can draw a parallel with another piece of legislation, I think we've certainly seen a parallel with what we're discussing here and the implementation of right to rent in England, for instance, which imposed some quite burdensome and sometimes some fairly expensive tests that you had to pass. You had to get certain documentation, you had to comply with certain requirements. And it's led to a subtle but a distinct movement towards simple cases. You know, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a discriminatory issue, but in terms of admin, you see a relatively simple, straightforward process, or you see a potentially more expensive, more complicated process. And I think it would be, you know, we're working on anecdotal evidence here, but I think it would be reasonable to suggest that people will favour the simple case if you're not allowed to recoup the costs of doing that longer, more burdensome process. I mean, I think the example in here could be using guarantors, for instance. If you have an applicant who presents to you with all their documentations demonstrating their income, which meets your tests, it's very simple to glass that over on day one and say, yes, pending credit checks, you should pass. If somebody presents with quite a chaotic lifestyle or an alternative household, and you know there's going to be a requirement for a guarantor who will also have to be referenced, well, it's twice the work. So I do think it's perfectly reasonable to incorporate into your charge to landlord that you're doing your due diligence. But if you're doing twice the work, and you would previously have charged for that, you will probably go for candidate A versus candidate B.
So if the guarantor was a local authority, that would be fine, yeah?
It would probably be easier, yes. I mean, if you have a relationship with...
They're very unlikely to go bust, aren't they?
That's very true, but they're not always so easy to work with. No.
Okay. Just as you've mentioned it...
Jenny, just before you go on then, David.
Scarcity of supply now. So if there was an inducement to cherry pick, it would happen now. But there are certain properties in the market that are going to appeal to a certain type of tenant. And that is what is the force that distributes the sort of the rentals of certain properties. So I cannot see how a charge of £200 or £100 that we've heard in terms of, you know, the difference that this legislation is going to make is going to affect that calculation. Because if you're cherry picking, or you might, you'd be doing it now because of the scarcity in the market.
I would suggest people are. I mean, you've only got to speak to applicants for property who are reliant on local housing allowance or universal credit to find out how difficult it can be to access property. And that's exactly the kind of administrative discrimination or the cherry picking that we are seeing. Now, I'll take your point entirely. Just removing the fee isn't going to change the world. You know, people aren't going to suddenly, who weren't pre-screening tenants, aren't suddenly going to start doing it. But it's cumulative. And if you're already struggling to access and you put in this additional barrier or this additional cost for the probably agent in most cases we're talking about, it's going to make it even more difficult.
Yeah, and I think we've got to look at it from the two different perspectives. So with landlords directly, they probably are doing that to a certain extent. The vast majority of landlords don't reference tenants in quite the same way as an agent would, because the agent's got a separate liability to the landlord, and they've got to have a proof. If the agent puts a bad tenant into that property, then the landlord's going to be coming after the agent, and they've got to prove that they did their due diligence. Whereas I think a lot of other landlords tend to base it a lot more on who they meet as a person and whether does their story add up. They speak to their previous landlord a bit more personally on the phone, that sort of thing. So I think there is pre-screening going on with landlords already. It's going to be more the case with the agents, because it's their business, it's their time, it's a considerable difference to the way they're doing it, and they see far more people coming through their door than the average landlord. I mean, the average landlord will pop up once every 3 or 4 years to find the tenant for that property and then go to ground again. But the agent's in that business all the time, so there's going to be a lot more of this screening going on.
Okay, Jenny?
Renting, private renting is absolutely fine for people who are passing through, who have temporary situations. Students are an obvious example in my constituency. But most people who want stability wouldn't choose to rent if they had other options, or privately rent anyway. So, the Minister said there was compelling evidence why tenants should not be paying the letting agency fee, because it's the landlord who's benefiting from the service. You're selling something that people are prepared to buy. So why should the tenant, who in many cases can't even recoup the cost of the fee from if they're in receipt of housing benefit, what is the possible argument for it being imposed on the tenant?
I think in many cases, or in many elements of that charge, the Minister's absolutely right. The landlord is procuring a service. That service is to find them a tenant, to establish a tenancy. Mm-hmm. I think there are certain elements of that where there are two beneficiaries. I think when we're talking about that element of pre-screening, or avoiding that element of pre-screening, where we're talking about referencing and particularly checking in where there is a risk, if that process isn't followed properly, that both parties could be harmed by a poor service or the outcomes further down the line. I think there's an argument for sharing some of that cost. I think what's been very interesting for us as an association is we've been speaking to our members a lot more about their interactions with letting agents, and it hadn't occurred to us quite as much how little a lot of landlords understand the charging structure of their agents. From our point of view, if you as a landlord contract an agent, you are their client. They have a responsibility to serve you as a client. We all know there's a duty of care to the tenant, but as far as we're concerned, we were paying for that service. I think this process and the process in Scotland with their fee ban and the process going on in England at the moment has shined light on a lot of double charging. And there's actually a lot of landlords out there saying, well, why are my potential tenants being charged for these services, like drawing up a tenancy agreement, for instance, which, so far as I, as a landlord, am concerned, I've already paid for. So I think there is an element of truth, of validity in what the Minister said there. We'd just like to make sure that there is a true understanding of who are the beneficiaries to different services, and therefore those costs are met by the people who are benefiting the most.
Okay. So, do you think this bill will chase out some of the amateur landlords who really have little understanding of what their responsibilities are?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit cautious about the term amateur. I mean, I would say that a lot of the NLA's members are amateur because they have other jobs as well. It doesn't mean they're not responsible. I think we do need, with this piece of legislation and lots of other areas of legislation and enforcement particularly, need to drive out those people who are irresponsible, who do flout the law, who, even if they are amateur, don't want to provide a good service. I would question to what extent this bill will achieve that. I mean, I think, as Douglas mentioned earlier on, in Wales you have an opportunity, because of Rent Smart Wales and because of the licensing that exists, to use some other channels, some other methods to affect some of that change before resorting to something like this. There is legislation already that requires transparency and that requires enough information to be given to the consumer to drive some kind of competition, which I don't see being adhered to particularly well. I certainly don't see a lot of enforcement about. And I think because with Rent Smart Wales you know who the landlords are, you know who the letting agents are, and you've got other ways to engage with them, there was perhaps an opportunity to do something just prior to primary legislation, which is an opportunity missed at the moment.
I would agree with all of it, but especially the final point. I mean, we would rather have seen. We've got the Consumer Rights Act and the transparency of fees, which has not been enforced, and there's not been an opportunity really to educate the community at large through that process. And actually, that is a route that we could have taken to look at maybe capping fees prior to something full blown like this, and that could be a shorter term route in getting this up and running. Whilst we look at possibly doing a wider piece of work about trying to achieve a better system under which agents can operate, because say we've got the opportunities under Rent Smart Wales in terms of licensing conditions and changing the way that agents operate in the sector, and I really do think we need to address how agents are charging their landlords and what services they're providing, as well as what they're doing. So, but to come back to your original point, no, you're absolutely right. There has been double charging going on. Some of the fee levels are ridiculous within the sector, and the trickle fees are probably the worst example of that. When you think you're getting one thing and you end up paying 2 or 3 times the amount by the end of the process to get through the referencing. There is a core cost to this, which is much lower and I think much more reasonable, of £75, £100, £150, depending on where you are in the country, and that's what we should have been looking at rather than an outright ban.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jenny. David?
This is about the general principle now. I find it difficult that there is this level of opposition, given that we've heard from the letting agents that the overall costs tend to average out for tenants' fees at £200. They think in a new system that bans those fees, in the system about £100 of that will get passed on to tenants, and so some of that will fall elsewhere. And we're looking at a system of fairly limited costs on or loss of costs in terms of the letting agents, and then additional costs you may face or have to recover in your rentals. But the benefit is that we abolish the rogue fees and drive out the very poor letting agents who are shouldn't be in the market in the first place. So why do you have this huge problem with this piece of legislation?
I don't think we have a huge problem with the some of the goals of the legislation. It's just the way that it's coming forward. Ultimately, it's going to create a level of innovation, and I look forward to seeing how that happens. Some of the innovation that if you look at some of the scrutiny in England, some of the innovation has been going about purely online models, but actually purely online models mean that you're not accessing an entire section of the market, and it's excluding a significant proportion of the market, and also the level of service that they're providing to. I mean, they're probably quite good for our members, because a lot of our members are self-managing landlords. They're quite independent landlords, and that they come to us for information and various services, and if there's a cut price way of finding tenants, then they're more likely to use that. But there's a huge proportion of landlords out there which are managed landlords, and therefore these models aren't available to them. But there will be ways that we continue to cut the price. So our concern is, I have two sides. So directly for my members, in the sense that fees will end up going up, and as a result of that, you've got to look at. I keep being told, oh well, it's just this cost, it's just this little bit of cost. You've got Rent Smart Wales, it's only £33.50, and then there's an extra licensing cost, and then I get told by the UK government that we've got tax changes, which is only another £700, £800 a year on top of your current charges, and then I get renting homes, which is coming in, which is a good piece of legislation overall. We could have gone further with it, but we are where we are. But overall, there's a lot of good stuff in it, but that's going to put costs up to the sector again. And it's this cumulative thing of keep putting costs up. And when you're renting a 3-bedroom house in the Rhondda Valley for £350 a month, how much more costs can you continue to absorb in those properties, in those areas? Some areas, some of the student properties, some in central Cardiff, central Swansea, those sorts of things, probably got a bit more in them to be able to absorb some of these costs. But really, you're talking about some of the rural areas and the provision of housing in those areas. And also the number of agents in those areas. You've got some areas that we were looking at. The agents providing services to landlords, there's only 1 or 2 in an area. And if they're losing a significant proportion of their fees that can't be passed on to the landlords in those areas, then I'm really worried that there's going to be a complete lack of choice or completely devoid of any such service in those areas.
I think I'd quite agree. I mean, I would say that from the NLA's point of view, we don't have a huge, in principle, objection to the goals of this legislation. We are concerned about the rising cost base for landlords in providing homes, which is essentially what we're doing. And if the cost of those homes keeps going up, it's not good for the reputation of the private rented sector. It's not good for those people, whether they're transiting, as we say, into another tenure, or whether they have made the decision that private renting, or renting in general, is for them. Because there's this view that there's almost an infinite elasticity in the private rented sector, that no matter how much cost you put on, it'll get absorbed, and it's just complaining from the sector, from the landlords and the agents, if we talk about passing on in rents. There is a limited elasticity in a tenant or a household's ability to pay for their accommodation. Likewise, there's a limited elasticity in the landlord or the owner of the property's ability to absorb costs. We see reported generally in Wales about a 4.7, 4.8% average yield for a buy-to-let landlord. Now, that's better than you're going to get in lots of similar investments. And we're not complaining about that. There's an opportunity for us. But it's not infinite. And it can't absorb some of the tax changes and licensing costs and selective licensing costs and additional regulatory burden, and now additional costs passed on perhaps from a letting agent. I mean, if we dare to be optimistic, I am hopeful actually that this will lead to the kind of innovation that Douglas has mentioned, and particularly in letting agency, because I think there has been a poor culture among a lot of letting agency businesses, saying well, the industry average is 10 to 15% of the rent, therefore we'll provide a service. We needn't go into that. We didn't improve that service. That's what the landlord will pay, because that's the market. And no real competition amongst high streets. You go onto high streets and you can go from one end to the other and find maybe 2% variation in the fees they charge to a landlord. Well, it's probably because they're making money back on the tenant fees at the moment, which arguably they shouldn't be, but also because they're not competing with one another. And I hope this leads to some competition in quality and competition in fee.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Bethan.
Yeah, I just wanted to go on the provision of certain payments. I will say that right one time today. Just regarding default payments, there is some concern that there might not be enough guidance on this issue, and that there could be a longer list of what default payments would be under this particular instance, because if you ban fees, then default payments could become larger at the whim of the agent. We heard from the previous people giving witness that there was enough clarity as to what that would mean, but the model contracts are provided for in a different bill, which we haven't seen for this bill, which is again another timing issue from my perspective. But I just wondered if you were confident that default payments were explained enough in this bill, or whether there needed to be more clarity on what that they would entail in case some landlords or some agents decided to add a big list to tenants.
I think at the moment it's reasonably clear and it seems proportionate. The devil will be in the detail. I think some guidance will be crucial to enable this to work. I think you've got to be cautious not to try to legislate for every eventuality though. You know, there will be occurrences in a tenancy that may not easily be foreseen, and eventually if there is a dispute, I think we have to have faith in the courts process for that to be recouped. I think I'm sceptical that many landlords or agents will try to recoup the costs through default, just because there are easier ways for them to do it through rent. You know, if they are determined that they can't make efficiency improvements and they have to carry on charging that fee somehow, it's much easier to put 3% on the rent, 4% on the rent, than to think, I'm going to wait until they lose their keys and then triple the fee for that. Or I'm going to wait until they're late a day or two and then charge them. We've got to be cautious and we've got to be vigilant. But I think it's far more likely that if people try to find other ways around this or to circumvent, they'll do so more straightforward.
Would they add things to the contract is another way of doing it? Not particularly on the defaulting, but in the upfront contract they would sign. Would they potentially do that then? Obviously, because we haven't seen any model contracts yet, we wouldn't know what that would entail, but would you see that they would add stuff on there?
My expectation is that most elements that you add to the contract there, if they're for the continuation or the granting of the tenancy, will be prohibited by this bill. So I think that would be quite limited in their ability to do that. And I think we've got to be very clear on the type of default or the type of charge that can be made against the security deposit versus in tenancy, because there are lots of things that happen will simply be recouped at the end of the tenancy via the tenancy deposit. So yes, we've got to be careful, but we're not particularly concerned about that possibility.
Yeah, I think it's because the thing that a lot of people are concerned about are the costs at the end. You know, agents and landlords trying to recoup things at the end of a tenancy and take out the deposit. To be fair to the way that the deposit legislation currently works, I think there's lots of issues with it. But actually, the adjudication process and the robustness of that system is there to prevent any crazy excess charges. Because ultimately, if it's protected, you are protected by the dispute resolution process. If it's not protected, then you can get your money back and 3 times that. So you're there. I mean, there were sort of scaremongering newspaper articles about charging ridiculous things for clearing out a jar of peanut butter or something like that. But you know, if you took it to dispute, you wouldn't get it through. Full stop. And if anybody wants to come and try a dispute process with us at any time, then they're more than welcome to, and they'll be surprised how robust it is. So that parks that, and that's the vast majority of ways that you could get money back. The default fees outside it, as Chris has alluded to, it's like, well, you know, how many? They are just things that you charge for if the tenant has done something wrong or lost a key, or you dumped rubbish in the wrong bin and you're getting fined by the council, and that sort of thing. You know, it's those things which actually probably don't happen very often. And so I think landlords probably will increase slightly what they're doing, because I think at the moment landlords don't value their time. They really don't value their time outside of when they're doing any extra work. And I think if they're going to be charged more through all the things that I've already mentioned, plus what's going on here, and it's not just caused by this, but they are going to say, well, if I am going out and letting a tenant in at 2 o'clock in the morning, then I actually, you know, I probably will charge what my time is worth for that, as opposed to doing it for free.
Okay, just regard the utilities and communication services, this bill doesn't specifically permit landlords or agents to require contracts in this regard. Is that something that you would want to change to see in this bill?
I think we need certainty. I think that's part of the discussion that's taken place in Westminster on the parallel bill. There are times when utility costs are included as part of a rental package, and that needs to be taken into account. We don't want to see, I think in the previous session, one of the witnesses referred to PPI. You know, we don't want to see a return of that kind of ambulance chasing culture if something is decided later on to have been in or outside the scope of the bill. So whether it's included or not, We just need to be absolutely clear from day one.
Okay. Just coming on to the issue of security deposits, and I quoted your evidence earlier in relation to the insurance-based schemes that you have in terms of, or propose in terms of transferring a deposit from one rental property to another. We heard in evidence that there was exemptions put into the English bill where those types of schemes would be allowed, because obviously my concern would be if something was benefiting the tenant, that would be something that would be prohibited in this particular bill. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and you know, whether the bill goes far enough to allow for these new types of schemes to come through to their biggest potential, really.
Yeah, I'm really keen on innovation in the marketplace, and I'm particularly keen on at the moment on innovation around deposits. We've, as an organisation and personally, we've been exploring how we can free up this section of the market. I'm very concerned that there are some scandalous schemes out there at the moment which landlords need to be particularly wary of. We're highlighting them and trying to get our members to avoid them. But I think we're just at the beginning of this process. We've got a couple of schemes that have recently launched. They're possibly tying in with tenant passport type schemes, and which will help with the vulnerability side. Those that would find it more difficult to generate.
But that isn't included in this bill. Do you think that should be included here, as well as the banning of letting agents?
I think we need to be able to allow these things to happen. At the moment, there's not a, as far as I understand it, and I may be wrong, it's about having an option to, if you choose to take that up, then you can use it. But if there's only one option, then you can't enforce that as a cost within that bill. So, but we would like to see deposit schemes which allow landlords to be able to secure a greater proportion of their rents for tenants with higher risk to be able to insure against themselves. And so if they're like a foreign student with no background coming to the UK, well, not just students, there's plenty of people coming here to work as well with no credit history or guarantor in the UK to support them. Some sort of deposit schemes, insurance-based deposit schemes. It's also talking with some MPs as well about pets. Going back to a reference that Jenny said earlier, I'd slightly dispute that nobody comes to deliberately or chooses to live in the private rented sector. There's increasing evidence that actually, I think it was the last English Housing Survey, 60% of people surveyed said that they actually really enjoyed being in the private rented sector, and 80% is over an 80% satisfaction rating within the private sector overall. So, but we need to mature. I recognise we need to mature as a market. Pets are an example. Of being able to grant long-term tenancies and families and these sorts of things. Pets are an integral part of families, but they're a high-risk option for landlords. And if you're capping deposits or not allowing innovative schemes that allows you to cover your pet situation, you say, right, okay, well, I'll pay a slightly extra bit on a deposit protection premium, so that I can have 2 dogs in the house. That's not unreasonable. And the big thing is this double whammy that you get when you move from one property, because it takes 14 days, a month, sometimes in extreme cases, for a deposit to be released, and you've got to put down another deposit for your next house. And that's
we are told that this type of thing, the passporting, would be outside of the scope of the bill. I mean, I dispute that, because I think this would be helping tenants. What is that your view as well, that this would be beneficial to tenants?
Absolutely. We need to look at a way of not closing off this market, because there's a real potential that people can come into this market, and it will benefit both landlords and tenants. But I really do think it will benefit tenants.
Okay, we need to.
Okay, sorry about that. Just with regards to the limit for security deposits, and setting that in regulations is the current proposition. We heard earlier again that was something that they would want to see come to the Assembly as opposed to set in regulations. Is that something that you agree with? And should there be a 6 or 8 weeks limit set in legislation?
I think as the bill is currently drafted is a major concern for us, because obviously you don't have that same degree of debate over where that may be set. I mean, as an organisation, we don't favour capping security deposits. I've not seen any real evidence that there are excessive deposits being charged, true security deposits.
But could it change if this bill was put forward, though?
I don't believe so, because I think there's a misunderstanding about what makes up moving costs. A lot of the time when we see the very genuine challenges that tenants find in bringing together all of the monies they need to move in, because they've got their first month's rent, they've got their deposit, they've got, at the moment, fees, plus all of the other costs of moving house, which we're all familiar with. I think they tend to get lumped in together, and you see these figures of £2,000, £3,000, £4,000 to move house. The security deposit never becomes the landlord's money. The security deposit always remains the tenant's money. Legislation already protects that. As Douglas mentioned earlier, there's a really robust arbitration process. It's not in the landlord's interest or the agent's interest to ramp up a security deposit they can't use as operating capital, because it becomes a barrier to getting people in the homes. You know, you actually want to fill that home as quickly as you possibly can. You don't want to put an arbitrary amount of money up front that you can't profit from, just for the sake of it. So I've not seen a lot of evidence. I mean, we, as an organisation, we provide our members a facility to create tenancy agreements. And until the new standard contracts comes in, we've had an English and Welsh combined facility. Now, because of all the debate about security deposits, we went back and checked all of the information that we gather from that. And in Wales, it seems to us that over the last 7 years, there's been very little variation on the amount relative to the rent that landlords have charged for a security deposit. It's been between 4.7 and 4.9 weeks equivalent in our membership, which at the moment, if you look at the English proposals, it's 6 weeks, it falls within that. What it doesn't take into account are those circumstances like a pet, for instance, where you would perhaps, as a tenant, want to say, I know a landlord might not be comfortable having my 2 dogs living in this house, therefore I'd like to give you, or I understand that you want, an extra month's deposit in case there are damages. I, as a landlord, can't use that money for anything other than to mitigate my risk. It sits either in a custodial scheme or with an insurance policy attached to it, and it only gets used by me and only becomes my money if there is a default at the end of the tenancy.
Okay.
And there's a third party that decides whether there has been.
Do you want me to ask about the upper limit? Just quickly, sorry, if you have any concerns about the fines incurred for requiring credited payments are not subject to any upper limit, do you think that's reasonable?
That does, it does make me nervous, yes.
Okay.
I would prefer to see limits on things, or certainly very clear guidance as to what is being intended.
Okay.
So that would be my
Thanks.
preference.
So you could just trafod.
I would like to now turn to another kind of deposit, namely the holding deposits. Are you content with the provision in the bill in terms of this aspect of things, in terms of holding deposits?
I think largely holding deposits play a role, particularly as you remove fees. They will arguably play a more important role, because they do exactly as I say on the tin. They hold that property until an agreement can be reached and until someone can move in. The provisions at the moment seem reasonable. And once again, I'm not convinced there is much of an argument at the moment for legislating on holding deposits, because we've not seen evidence that there's an abuse. But if you're going to remove fees, I can see the logic.
Do most landlords now have the holding deposits? Do they use that system with every tenancy?
Not with every tenancy, no. I think it is more common with letting agencies, but it's not uncommon for private landlords to take a deposit, depending on the market you're in. I mean, a lot of markets are so fast that there isn't an enormous need, but there is obviously competition, and it's beneficial to both parties, because you don't want to see, if you are in a very hot market, for instance, a property that you as a tenant have reserved being taken by somebody else who comes in and offers, say, a premium rent. So it does happen, but it's not necessarily the norm.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it. From our landlord's perspective, I don't see massive issues around the holding deposit because of the way they tend to operate in the market. I can see huge complications for agents going forwards, and operating it in the way it's been legislated I think is going to be very, very difficult for them to manage. And I can actually see a lot of agents not taking holding deposits at all and kind of operating in a tournament style approach, which I wouldn't really like to see. I think I would want to see greater clarity on what we would say is recoverable for a landlord or an agent in that holding deposit, because I think could be quite a lot of debate around what can I keep if the tenancy doesn't go through. And I think it's one thing that is important to note for landlords through this process is what landlords are selling is time in a property, and if a tenant doesn't move into a property or says that they're going to bring documents and then doesn't bring the documents, and it drags on, the landlord can't recover that rental time. So it's fine if ultimately it's far enough ahead that the current tenant's still in there, and you find a new tenant and everything, and there's been no genuine impact on the landlord. But if it's empty and you're waiting on a tenant to bring all the documents and things like that, and the landlord loses time as a result of that, I think that's something to genuinely consider about how you might recover money from the holding deposit. Ultimately, a week's not a long time to try and recover that money from there. So.
Okay, and what about this idea that there should only be one holding deposit at a time for particularly, for properties?
To reserve a particular property?
Yeah.
I think that's going to be very difficult to police.
But without that aspect, what about in theory?
Again, I think it depends on what clarity we get on what you can recover from the holding deposit. Because for me at the moment, that's not the case, not particularly clear. So, as I say, for landlords directly, I don't think it's going to be a massive issue, but I do think it's going to be a big issue for agents. And so, should there be only one holding deposit? It depends on what we see in terms of what you can recover from that holding deposit and how easy that's going to be.
So again, you're seeing unforeseen consequences for the tenant ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm very concerned that we will enter a tournament style approach to people getting properties.
Could I just bring Beth and
So I
Syed
just
in?
wanted to ask why you said that there wasn't enough clarity on the holding deposits, because obviously I can see from the bill that it explains what it would be used for. So I just wanted to understand what you weren't clear about.
In terms of what you can recover from so if a tenancy doesn't go through, that's when the issues arise. If a tenancy is granted, holding deposit can be passed on to the rent or the deposit. No issues there. If the tenancy doesn't go through, either because excess delays, so that would be a really good example. So you've taken a week's holding deposit. You've got 14 days to sign a contract. So at the end of that, the tenant hasn't presented all of their documents. So are we now allowed to take that whole holding deposit?
Okay.
For me, that's good, because ultimately we've lost 14 days to let that property. That's irrelevant of any work that's been done that you might be able to deduct from that. The tenancy's not been granted. Tenant might come back 2 days later, but you may have found another tenant, but you've then lost 14 days. So it's those nuances that occur when you're renting, that you understand when you're renting, that we would like to see slightly more clarified, I suppose.
Okay, Sian, are you content? Yes, we'll move on to enforcement and David Melding.
Yeah, in general, I notice Dr. David Smith, I think policy director of RLA, but yeah, he is, in giving evidence to the Westminster Committee is looking at similar law proposal there, said that the Act to ensure that fees are upfront and advertised has not been very well enforced, and this point has also been made to us this morning by the letting agents. So, I mean, is that your view, that the current legislation around tenant fees is very poorly enforced, and therefore, does that mean it's either been observed by everyone or it's a dead letter?
Probably got the same views on this, haven't we?
I think we probably have. I mean, in a word, yes, it's not being enforced. Or it's being enforced very much in the default and very reactively. It's something that, from our point of view, could be very easily enforced proactively. It's quite easy for a local authority or a trading standards body to go up and down a high street and look into agencies and see whether there are clear advertising, or even to do a desktop exercise of looking on websites. It's very easy to see that it's not being observed, yet there's been very, very little prosecution, very, very little enforcement. There's not been a lot of active work. There's also not been a lot of elapsed time. There's not been a thorough review as far as we're concerned, and we're jumping on to another step of intervention. I think there's, as we mentioned before, a lot that could be done before we get to this particular stage.
And for the purpose of this morning, does the same danger exist in this proposed legislation, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's, in essence, it's slightly easier to see. Under the Consumer Rights Act, it was actually reasonably difficult for the local authority to enforce it. The great thing here is you've got, and you won't hear me say this very often, you've got Rent Smart Wales. So, you can either do the desktop study on your licensed agents to see whether it's happening, or you can go down your high street and see your licensed agents and their addresses and see if there are any agents that aren't there. And that's what I'd like to see more of that happening. So it's but I suppose the problem is that the ones that don't operate necessarily directly on your high street. But it's going to be with the enforcement, it's got to be a combination of empowering the tenant to be able to do it, which you've done partly in this bill, and then making it very easy for the local authority to issue the fines or take it.
So then part of the process, which I expect is is designed to make it fairly easy, is that presently, if it's local authorities or the enforcing agencies, they can issue a fixed penalty notice of £500 if they suspect, with reasonable cause, that an offence has been committed. What do you think of that type of regime? Do you think that's a fair way of administrating enforcement at that lower level? And is 500 effective?
I think across the board we've seen very poor enforcement when it comes to housing legislation, particularly private rented housing legislation. So making it simple, providing those options that don't incur significant costs for the enforcing body, I think are very positive. The flip side to that is making sure there is appropriate appeal and there is appropriate access to evidence, and that you don't effectively appoint a judge, jury and executioner in one body, which is a slight concern. On the basis of the fines, perhaps as a landlord representative I shouldn't say, but I'm not sure what use a £500 fine is in this instance. You've got particularly very significant fees. I mean, again, for a landlord that would be significant. Yeah. For a letting agent, if they were willfully ignoring the legislation and charging fees, they could be bringing in multiple tens of thousands of pounds a year in fees. And if there's not effective enforcement catching them every single time, a £500 fine is going to be nothing.
Yeah, we're making good progress, which is why I'm keen to sort of move you on. So, in fact, we've heard from the letting agencies that have given evidence this morning that they believe that if they don't want this law, but if it's coming in, they think it should be enforceable and it should act as a deterrent. And the fixed penalty at 500 wouldn't do that, and 5,000 is. Well, add a note is what they actually said, so 5,000. So I think you are probably in the same place on that, are you?
Yeah, I think I was going to bring up as well that you really should be looking probably at different penalty costs for landlords versus agents. For a landlord, £500 I think is going to be quite a lot of money in a deterrent. For an agent, £500 is. Yeah. You need to do more than that.
And do you think that? If we have a fixed penalty regime, then that ought to be linked to a requirement to repay the charge that was improperly imposed on the tenant.
I think so, yes. I'm aware that there's potential complications around that, but we've got to restore the tenant to the position.
And it seems illogical not to have that, as part of the requirement to
if it was going to happen, it should probably be repaid to the local authority. Then that repays it to the tenant, so that there's clarity that has been.
And then there's bite as well, because if you don't pay it, then that'll be evident immediately. Have you any views on the lead enforcement agency? Some have suggested Rent Smart Wales, or a system where a local authority in Wales acts as the lead authority. At the minute, obviously, the model is going to be 22 local authorities, though in fairness to the Minister, she has you know, reminded us that there is ability in law for local authorities to voluntarily join together, and, you know, they may choose to do that.
I think I think where we've seen it in other areas, it's probably been helpful, partly because housing law, even just, I mean, the people that are enforcing are covering such broad ranges of things. You know, that having a lead authority allows a pot of expertise for things that if somebody out in the field says, okay, well, there's this, then they've definitely got somebody that they can contact and support them through the enforcement process. So I would probably say it's a fairly good idea.
There's certainly an efficiency that exists in bringing that together. I would expect we won't see a huge volume of enforcement against this. It's fairly black and white. You either comply or you don't. So making it as efficient as possible to enforce would be favourable.
And the regime in terms of the penalties there's quite a bit of a difference between the Welsh model and the English one. I won't go through all the details because I suspect you are familiar, but do you prefer the Welsh model, or do you think the English model's approach, you know, for instance, you could discharge a more serious liability under sections 2 and 3 at £30,000, I think it was. Well, you know, that isn't in the Welsh law. So how do you feel that balance is?
I think the preferable system would be one that is enforced, which might sound a little flippant, but we've seen a lot of legislation that's imposed and implemented but not really enforced. So we're looking at two hypothetical sets of circumstances. I truly hope that they're both implemented and enforced as intended, and therefore they'll be effective. I think some of the flexibility about being able to discharge the higher liability is positive, but it does come down to the detail and what the process will be and what access to evidence and appeal you'll have.
Yeah, I suppose it's easy to say things black and white at the beginning. There could be reasons why it's not so clear cut in some cases, and I suppose I would like to see flexibility around that. So, the ease of the way that the Welsh system's put together does seem quite good. But yes, it probably would be good to be able to have a ramping up process. But again, you've got the backstop then of any enforcement action being presented to Rent Smart Wales, hopefully. And I'm not entirely sure how that loop is closed through all of this, but hopefully that will clarify that going forwards, that these sorts of things will automatically be reported by the relevant local authority.
David, could I just ask at this stage, if landlords were prevented from serving notice if they'd taken a payment wrongly, would that be an effective deterrent in your view?
I mean, removing that, I'm assuming you're talking more about the no fault rather than the fault process. It's a very effective sanction. Problem being, if you look at what's happened with various moratoriums that have been attached to the Housing Act, it's difficult to get the detail right, and it's difficult to be able to have some solution or some way to discharge the issue. So if you had that moratorium or that restriction that could be discharged at some point if there had been a genuine mistake, what you don't want to get to is a situation that, because of a misunderstanding on day one, you've created an indefinite security forever, frankly, which is what we're witnessing at the moment with some of the recent changes to the AST, for instance, where issues of evidence have not been properly recorded at the beginning of the tenancy. You know, you have provided a gas safety certificate, for instance, but you've not had a receipt, and that essentially is creating an imbalance on day one, and I think that would be the danger with this.
And very briefly on that, I would also not want to ever be used as a weapon to delay possession proceedings, which is what you get with the other things, because ultimately you can be turning up in court and then there'll be a spurious claim of they paid a fee at the beginning. Then the judge says, okay, we'll adjourn this while we look at it. So that's another 3-4 weeks where you had a possession claim delayed. We can't be in a position where that situation is created. That would be my primary concern.
Okay, David, just before you go on, Bethan, quickly.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to the lead authority issue. It just dawned on me that when the minister came in, she said that a reason for the individual authorities, as I understood it, was that they could potentially make money from the fines if they enforced it, so that would benefit the local authorities to enforce, because they could see, you know, pound figures attached to any enforcement process. But if there would be a lead authority, I'm just worried about how that would work, in the sense that if, say, Powys was doing it, then, would there be a need to ensure that each local authority still had the ability to accrue their own
I may be
penalties?
wrong with this. Please do correct me, but I believe that the money gained from the fixed penalty notices is ring-fenced towards enforcement. So if you've got a lead...
action, I think that's the issue.
Right. So yes, there could be a disincentive, but I think if what we all want to see is valid enforcement, whether that's being done by one authority, whether that's being done by 22 authorities, if essentially the funds that are derived from that are going back into enforcement as an organisation, I don't think we are particularly...
So it's just about enforcement. You wouldn't care really how it was divvied out or how it was done, as long
as it facilitated effective enforcement in the future.
Okay, thanks. Sorry,
Okay, David?
And similarly, if there is court action, I presume that you believe that ought to be attached to the repayment of any inappropriate charge on the tenant, just as with a fixed penalty. So I think we can move on from that. The final area then is, do you think there should be any element of compensation for the tenants who've been inappropriately charged?
I think when it comes to compensation, you've got to demonstrate harm, and you've got to demonstrate that any compensation is proportionate to the harm that's caused. If there are instances where you can demonstrate that the charge, perhaps, let's say if the charge were towards the end of the tenancy and that charge could be determined to have prevented somebody from accessing housing again, I can see there being an argument. But I think the circumstances where you could point to a definite detriment would be quite limited, and they would have to be, I think they would have to be specified quite clearly.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to see any replication of the deposit scheme type, because it's incredibly arbitrary, doesn't demonstrate any harm as a result of it. A lot of times in that scheme the money gets refunded, there's no harm at all caused, that it wasn't protected, and people are still getting quite severe payouts. So.
Okay, you consent,
Thank you.
David? Yeah, okay. And Gareth Bennett.
We've already got the Consumer Rights Act, which it states that letting agents must publicise details of the fees that are charged to tenants and landlords. To what extent do you think there's been non-compliance with that, and why do you think that's the case? And do you have any thoughts on whether the bill should contain specific provisions to amend the Consumer Rights Act?
It's very difficult to say what level of non-compliance has been caused by it, because there's been next to no enforcement of it. So that might be because everybody's complying, or we're just not enforcing. So, and I can't say that we've done any surveys of anything like that. So, again, it's one of those things, we bring a law in, well-intentioned, definitely heading in the right direction, but what do we do to empower consumers and make people aware that this is actually what is available to them? And I think we just constantly miss this step in the legislation making process, and it's something that we need whenever we're doing something like this for the consumer, particularly in these sorts of areas. We need to be backing it up with the appropriate education programs.
So because of the lack of enforcement, you don't have any view on whether there should be provisions in this bill to amend the Consumer Rights Act, because we don't know if there's anything particularly wrong with the Consumer Rights Act.
It's difficult because we don't have that information.
Yeah.
I think it is important when we're looking at how that Act is going to be implemented and enforced in the future that we remember that some fees will still be allowed, and they're the fees to the landlord. Mm-hmm. And there is still a need for a requirement to make sure they are clear and transparent, and hopefully helps drive some of that innovation and that competition that we've talked about. Yeah. So you're right, because there's so little data, it's difficult to say what amendment might be needed, unless you could have an amendment that simply said get on with it. But it does need to be, we can't just dismiss the obligations that are in that Act because tenant fees are bad. We've got to remember that they're all still landlords there and they're still paying fees.
Okay. Is that okay, Gareth?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you both very much for coming in to give evidence to the committee this morning. You will be sent a transcript to check for factual accuracy in the usual way. Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much. Okay, the committee will break for almost 10 minutes until 11:25.